After the millionaire father's funeral, the stepmother expels the little girl who cries and begs, "Please, Mom, don't leave me alone on the streets. It's dangerous for me." She intended to get rid of the burden of taking care of the poor girl. But what she never expected was that the millionaire father would arrive right at the moment of the cruel act. Seconds later, what he does leaves the stepfather and stepmother remorseful and much more. The scent of lilies was the only thing that felt real, sweet, heavy, and cold. It clung to the velvet curtains and the dark fabric of the dresses, a fragrance that promised eternity, but to little 8-year-old Helena, smelled only of goodbye. Seated on a stiff chair in the corner of the country club ballroom, she watched the world of adults move in slow motion. Men in impeccable suits, whose fortunes were whispered about in the corners, shook her stepmother Veronica's hand, offering rehearsed condolences. Women with pearl necklaces touched her shoulder with chilled fingers, saying her father had been a good man, a business visionary whose estate would leave an invaluable legacy. Helena clutched the small photograph she kept in her dress pocket, the crumpled image of her father smiling, his eyes shining like 2 gold coins in the sun. He wasn't there. They said he had disappeared on a trip, a dangerous expedition to oversee a new investment in a distant land. And without a body, they had organized this hasty memorial, a symbolic celebration that felt more like a final act to consecrate their claim to the inheritance. Veronica, at the center of the ballroom, was the image of the perfect widow. Grief suited her, an elegant accessory like her discreet jewelry. Her tears were controlled, appearing at the exact moment someone important approached, and then drying just as quickly so her makeup wouldn't smudge. Beside her, Richard, her companion, maintained a posture of quiet support, his hand resting on her back, in a gesture that should have meant comfort, but which Helena's watchful eyes perceived as possession. She saw the contained satisfaction at the corner of his mouth whenever someone mentioned the family's assets, the interest on their investments, the dividends from stocks that would now be under new management. The girl shrank in her chair. Her father had taught her about the stock market as if it were a board game, explaining how money worked to build things. But here, in this ballroom, money just seemed like a vulture, waiting for the right moment. Helena didn't understand liabilities or cash flow, but she understood absence, and the absence of her father was a cold hole in her chest. When the last guest had departed, leaving behind only the echo of conversations and the overwhelming scent of lilies, Veronica finally looked at Helena. Her face, once a mask of public sorrow, became rigid, as cold as the marble floor. On the way home, the silence inside the car was heavier than any speech. When they arrived at the mansion, the driver opened the door for them. Helena got out, clutching her school backpack, feeling the damp night air on her face. It was then that she saw the suitcase. Her suitcase, the one with colorful wheels her father had given her for her last birthday, was sitting there next to the imposing iron gate. Veronica grabbed her by the arm, the force in her fingers a stark contrast to the delicacy she displayed in public. "The house needs peace now, Helena. It needs a reorganization," she said, her voice low and sharp. And then, with a firm push, she put the girl outside, along with her suitcase and backpack. The gate closed with a final metallic click. Helena clung to the cold bars, her face pressed against the iron, tears finally streaming down, hot and desperate. She looked at the woman who had once promised to care for her, and at the man smiling beside her. "Please, Mommy, don't do this to me." The cold iron of the gate seemed to bite into the skin of her face. For an instant, Helena's world was reduced to that sound, the click of the gate, the hum of the car's engine driving away, and the frantic beating of her own heart. The darkness of the yard, once a place of games and secrets, now seemed filled with menacing shadows. The lights of the mansion went out one by one, leaving her in almost complete blackness, illuminated only by the faint yellow glow of a street lamp. The tears dried on her face, leaving a cold, salty trail, The initial desperation gave way to a paralyzing fear. She was alone, completely alone. That was when another light came on from the house next door. A small lamp on the porch, followed by the soft sound of a door opening. Mrs. Eleanor, the elderly neighbor who always offered her cookies when she saw her playing near the fence, appeared on the threshold, a shawl over her shoulders. Her eyes, small and bright, fixed on the tiny figure of Helena by the gate. Without a word, the old woman crossed her small garden and approached. My dear," her voice was a whisper, as fragile as a butterfly's wings. "What are you doing out here in this cold?" Helena couldn't answer. A sob escaped her throat. Mrs. Eleanor reached her thin fingers through the bars and touched her hand. "Come now, stay with me tonight." The kindness in her gesture was enough to break the girl's paralysis. Mrs. Eleanor led her into her house, a place that smelled of chamomile tea and old wood. The contrast with the coldness of the mansion was stark. Here, there was warmth, there was life. The old woman prepared her a cup of warm milk and sat her on the rough-textured sofa, covering her legs with a wool blanket. But the peace was short-lived. Less than an hour later, a loud, authoritative knock sounded at the door. Veronica was there, her face a mask of contained fury, with Richard a step behind, observing the scene with an air of impatience. "Thank you so much for your kindness, Eleanor, but Helena is under my care," Veronica said, her voice polished, but with an undercurrent of steel. "There was a misunderstanding. Her school has a grief counseling program for situations like this. They will handle it." She grabbed Helena's arm, pulling her away from the warmth of the neighbor's house. Mrs. Eleanor tried to argue, but Veronica was adamant, speaking about the need to follow protocols and ensure the child's emotional stability, using words that sounded good but held no substance. Back at the mansion, Helena was taken directly to her room. The door was closed, and she heard the unmistakable sound of a key turning in the lock from the outside. The air grew heavy, suffocating. She sat on the edge of the bed, her body trembling, feeling like a prisoner in her own home. Desolate, she opened her school backpack, searching for any trace of normalcy. It was then that her fingers touched a folded piece of paper, hidden in the secret pocket where she kept her little treasures. It was an old note, in her father's firm, familiar handwriting. She unfolded it under the dim light of the bedside lamp, her heart racing. The words seemed like a whisper from far away. "If I'm delayed, trust our secret word." The secret word. Helena repeated the phrase to herself. A silent mantra in the dark, locked room. Her father's letters on the note were a beacon in the fog of fear that enveloped her. But what was the word? They had so many codes, so many games that only the two of them understood. Could it be lighthouse, like the miniature he kept on his desk, or treasure, what he called the box of seashells they had collected at the beach? The night dragged on, long and sleepless, marked by the strange sounds of the house. Before, they were familiar noises. The creaking of wood, the hum of the refrigerator. Now they sounded like the footsteps of an intruder. In the morning, the door was unlocked, but freedom was an illusion. Veronica instructed her to come down for breakfast with the coldness of a boarding school headmistress. The table, once a place of conversation and laughter, was silent. Richard was reading the newspaper, his eyes scanning the stock market quotes, a furrow of concentration on his brow. He spoke in a low voice to Veronica about the need to consolidate the estate, to protect the capital from unexpected market fluctuations. It was then that Helena heard the sound. A sharp, repetitive metallic noise coming from the entrance hall. A man she had never seen before was crouched in front of the main door, tools spread across the marble floor. He was changing the lock. The girl's heart froze. That door, which her father had always opened with a smile upon returning home, would now hold a secret she didn't know. Throughout the day, the man moved through the house, methodical and silent, replacing every lock, one by one, erasing another trace of her father. Later, she saw Richard escorting two other men in suits through the house, talking about the property value, about investment potential. They were measuring the walls, assessing the assets. Turning her home into a business catalogue, Helena felt like a ghost, invisible and voiceless, wandering the halls of her own life. It was in one of those hallways that she found Maria, the housekeeper who had worked for her family since before she was born. Maria was polishing her father's collection of miniature ships, her face a mask of silent sorrow. Their eyes met for a brief second, and in that gaze, Helena saw a complicity, a loyalty that money could not buy. While Veronica and Richard were distracted on a call about the profitability of some funds, Maria approached with a quick, discreet movement. She wiped her hand on her apron and extended it to Helena. In her palm was a small brass key, tarnished with age, with a charm in the shape of an anchor. "Your father asked me to keep this," Maria whispered, her voice nearly inaudible. "He always called it his harbor." Before Helena could say anything, Maria closed the girl's fingers around the key and moved away, returning to her work as if nothing had happened. Helena stood frozen, the cold metal pressing against her skin. The word, the key, harbor. A wave of warmth and hope washed over her. She ran to her room, her heart pounding against her ribs, the small anchor seeming to weigh a ton in her hand. She sat on the bed to examine her treasure when the doorknob suddenly turned. Veronica entered, her eyes sharp as shards of glass, and her gaze swept the room, stopping on Helena's frightened face. "What are you hiding there?" Helena's heart leaped, hammering against her ribs. With the agility that only fear can grant, she closed her hand, hiding the small brass key, and pushed it under her thigh, all in one fluid, imperceptible motion. "Nothing," she replied. Her voice a trembling thread, she struggled to keep steady. Her wide, frightened eyes met Veronica's. Her stepmother studied her for a long moment, suspicion hanging in the air like a storm cloud. She scanned the room, searching for something out of place, a revealed secret. But Helena remained motionless, the personification of forced innocence, her hand sweating against the cool metal of the key. Finally, Veronica seemed to relax, perhaps concluding it was just the frightened imagination of a child. "Be ready in 5 minutes." "We're having breakfast," she ordered, her voice devoid of any warmth, before turning and leaving the door ajar as a warning. Helena waited for the sound of her footsteps to fade, and then looked at the small anchor in her hand. It was more than an object, it was a promise. That morning, the atmosphere at the dining table was even more tense. Veronica and Richard spoke in low, hurried tones about an important meeting at the bank. Words like net worth, assets and funds floated over the table. Richard was explaining the need to present a solid plan for managing the fortune, assuring the directors that the capital would continue to generate profit and that they were the competent guardians of this vast inheritance. "They'll want to see the documents, the clauses. We need to show that we have total control over the cash flow," he said, gesturing with a piece of bread. Veronica agreed, her face pale and focused. She looked less like a grieving widow and more like an executive about to close the deal of her life. Seizing their distraction, Helena slipped away from the table and ran, quiet as a mouse, to the library. It was her father's sanctuary, a room that smelled of leather, paper, and the faint scent of his pipe tobacco. Now, it felt like a mausoleum. With her heart pounding, she searched the drawers of the large mahogany desk. She found pens, paper clips, and notepads. In one of the side drawers, she found what she was looking for, the leather-bound planner her father used for personal notes. She flipped through it with trembling fingers, the pages filled with his elegant script. And then she saw it, noted in the margin of several pages, Next to dollar and euro amounts destined for charities and social projects was the word harbor. It wasn't a metaphor, it was a code, a logistical reference tied to his donations, to a part of his wealth that he kept separate, protected. A vivid memory assailed her. Her father, sitting in that very chair, showing her an old map. "Every sailor needs a safe harbor, my little one," he had said, pointing to a sheltered bay, a place to keep what is most valuable. What was most valuable to him? The answer came like a flash of lightning. Her. Veronica and Richard left for their meeting at the bank, leaving the house in an oppressive silence. Helena stood at the library window, watching the car disappear. She knew that time was running out. Before they left, she had heard Richard say to Veronica, "After the bank, the first thing we do is hire a decorator. This place needs to be modernized. Get rid of all this dust, these old books." The threat hung in the air. The library, the heart of her father's memory, was in danger. And somewhere, among those old books, a small harbor was waiting to be found. The threat of a decorator, of strangers invading her father's sanctuary and erasing his existence, was the fuel Helena needed. Fear gave way to a cold, focused determination. She stood in the library, the small anchor key in her hand, her father's note in her pocket. Harbor. The word echoed in her mind. A harbor wasn't just a place on a map, it was a refuge. Where would her father, a man who saw the world as a vast ocean of business and investments, hide his most precious asset? She looked at the walls, lined with books. There were hundreds, maybe thousands. Searching randomly would be impossible. She had to think like him. Her father was a man of logic, of patterns. The key was an anchor, the word was harbor. The answer had to be related to navigation. Her eyes scanned the leather spines, passing over titles on economics, art history, and the complexities of the stock market, and then she saw it. On a lower shelf, almost hidden behind an armchair, was an entire collection dedicated to great explorers and the art of navigating. Her heart began to beat faster. This was it. It had to be. Carefully, she began to slide her fingers behind each book in that section, feeling the cool, smooth wood of the shelf. Nothing. Book after book. Her hope began to falter, replaced by a pang of despair. It was then that her eyes landed on the thickest volume, a book her father used to read to her on stormy nights, Great Navigations. Its dark blue leather cover was worn from use. With both hands, she pulled it out. It was heavy, heavier than the others. As she removed it, something seemed different. The empty space it left on the shelf wasn't just wood. There was an inset metal plate, almost imperceptible, with a small keyhole in the center. Adrenaline surged through her. Before she could even try the key, the library door creaked open. Veronica and Richard entered, their faces grim. The bank meeting had clearly not gone as planned. "They want notarized copies of everything," Veronica hissed, throwing her handbag on the desk. "Clauses protecting the heiress, signed during his lifetime. As if I'm not capable of managing the estate. It's an insult." Richard ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. "It's a liability we didn't foresee. We need to change the narrative, Veronica. Now, we have to show we are the benevolent guardians of this multimillionaire's fortune, not just the beneficiaries. We need a public gesture." Veronica paused, her eyes glinting with a new idea. "A brunch, a charity brunch, here at the house. I'll invite the entire city. We'll announce the creation of a foundation in his name." Her eyes swept the library with contempt. And we'll start by cleaning this place out. Donate everything that's childish, that reminds us of the past. The house needs to be a stage for a new beginning, not a museum of memories." Her gaze met Helena's, standing by the bookshelf. A thin, cruel smile curved her lips. "Including that toy-filled room of yours. It's past time you grew up." Helena felt a knot form in her throat. As her stepmother planned to erase her world, she turned her back to them. Her small body hiding the secret lock moo, and with trembling fingers, she inserted the anchor key into the hole. The key turned with a soft, nearly inaudible click, a sound that was swallowed by Veronica's voice, who was now striding through the library with a renewed, predatory energy. Helena kept her back to them, her small body serving as a shield for the secret she had just unlocked. The fear of being discovered was a ball of ice in her stomach, but the conversation between her stepmother and Richard was her best camouflage. They were completely immersed in planning their social ascent. "A charity brunch is the perfect move," Richard said, his eyes gleaming with ambition. "It positions us as philanthropists, not vultures, that will placate the bank and buy us time to restructure the investments in our favor." Veronica agreed, running a hand over a bronze statue. "We'll create the C. Sterling Foundation. We'll use his name to build our own prestige. Part of the inheritance will go to it, of course, but the control of the capital, the cash flow, it will all be ours. It's the perfect business, an image asset that protects the fortune." While they wove their plans, Helena opened the small metal door. The compartment was tiny, lined with dark velvet. There was no gold, no stacks of dollars or euros. There were no treasure bars or property deeds. There was only a small, black object, a flash drive. For a second, a wave of disappointment hit her. What was this? A little piece of plastic against the immensity of her loss. But then she remembered her father's words about what was most valuable. With trembling fingers, she took the flash drive and hid it in her dress pocket, closing the safe and placing the heavy Great Navigations book back in its place, all in a rehearsed silence. At that moment, Maria appeared in the doorway, her face pale. Her eyes met Helena's, and with an almost imperceptible nod, she indicated the floor above. A warning. A terrible premonition seized Helena. She ran up the stairs, her heart beating erratically. When she reached her bedroom door, she stopped. It was open, and the room, once a universe of colors and dreams, was almost empty. The shelf of storybooks, bare. The dollhouse her father had built with her, gone. The large wooden chest where she kept her toys, her stuffed animals, her childhood secrets, had vanished. Empty cardboard boxes were stacked in a corner, proof of the swift and merciless execution of Veronica's order. The tears she had held back for so long came with force, silent and hot. Every donated toy was a memory torn away, a part of her father that had just been erased forever. It was a victory with a devastating cost. She had the key, the secret, but she had lost her world. She sat on the cold floor, her body shaking with mute sobs. Then she felt the hard outline of the flash drive in her pocket. It was the only thing she had left. She remembered the old tablet she used for schoolwork, forgotten in her desk drawer. Veronica and Richard, obsessed with the major assets, hadn't even remembered the small device. With her hands still trembling, she connected the flash drive. A single file appeared on the screen, a video icon. She clicked it. The screen went black for a second, and then her father's face filled it. He wasn't smiling. He was serious, his gaze fixed on the camera as if he could see her through time and fear. "My little navigator," he began, his voice deep and filled with a contained urgency. "If you're watching this, it's because I might be unable to speak. Trust our signal." The video was short, less than a minute. There were no explanations about his disappearance, no details about the business that kept him away. It was just a message from a father to his daughter, a time capsule of love and warning. When the screen went dark, Helena's face was reflected on the dark surface, pale and tear-stained. "Trust our signal." What signal? The secret word was harbor. The key was the anchor. But the signal was still a mystery. She hid the flash drive and the tablet in the back of a drawer, under piles of old socks, the only place that seemed safe. In the days that followed, the mansion transformed into a frantic stage. Veronica's order for a new beginning was being executed with brutal efficiency. A cleaning crew polished every inch of the house until the smell of lemon and disinfectant overpowered the familiar scent of wax and old books. Furniture was rearranged, rugs rolled up, and paintings removed from the walls. The house was becoming an impersonal, cold space, a showroom designed to impress the future guests of the charity brunch. Veronica was in her element, commanding the transformation with the precision of a general. She spent hours on the phone, organizing the catering, the guest list, and coverage from the local press. Helena watched her from a distance, a small shadow in the hallways of her own home. One afternoon, passing by the ajar library door, she heard her stepmother's voice. She was standing in front of the mirror, rehearsing a speech. The words sounded vaguely familiar. Because true wealth isn't in the assets we accumulate, but in the bonds we build. He believed the greatest investment is in the community, and that is why the Sterling Foundation will continue his legacy, generating dividends of hope for all. Helena felt a chill. Those were her father's words. She recognized them from the notebook he kept, the same phrases he had used when explaining to her why he donated part of his fortune. Veronica wasn't just stealing his money, she was stealing his soul. What no one in the house knew, however, was that the main narrative had already changed hands, hundreds of miles away, in a discreet, anonymous hotel room. Helena's father, Arthur Sterling, was very much alive. He wasn't on an exotic expedition, but in a strategic retreat advised by his lawyer. An attempted fraud in his international dealings, a leak of classified information about a new cryptocurrency his company was developing, had forced him off the grid to identify the traitor. On that first night, the night of the memorial, the need to retrieve a crucial document from his office had brought him back home. He used a service key, entering from the side, moving with the silence he had learned on his travels. His plan was simple: grab the folder and leave unseen. But as he headed for the exit, the sound of the front gate stopped him. He hid behind one of the large marble pillars at the entrance, and then he saw it. He saw his daughter, small and helpless, being pushed out into the darkness. He heard her cry, her desperate plea, and sharper than any blade, he heard Veronica's voice, speaking to Richard as they turned to go inside. Finally, free of that weight. In that instant, the corporate fraud became secondary. The betrayal he was investigating in his business was nothing compared to the one he had just witnessed. A cold, calculating fury took hold of him. This was no longer a game about money or power. It was about justice. And he was the player who had just seen all of his opponent's cards. Arthur Sterling stared at the city skyline through his hotel room window, but he didn't see the buildings or the lights. He saw his daughter's face, pale and frightened, pressed against the iron bars of her own home. The image was seared into his mind. A cold fire that burned away any emotion that wasn't rage and determination. That moment, that witnessed cruelty, had changed everything. His lawyer, a trusted gray-haired man named Elias, sat across from him, a stack of documents on the table. "The clauses in the family trust are clear, Arthur," Elias said, his voice calm and measured. "Helena is the primary beneficiary. Any act that harms her or removes her from the home constitutes a grave violation. The net worth is protected and becomes inaccessible to anyone who commits such an act." Arthur nodded, his jaw tight. "Inaccessible isn't enough, Elias. I want them to lose the stage. I want the truth to be the only narrative. If I show up now, it will look like a theatrical miracle. We need proof, an irrefutable moment." Back at the mansion, preparations for the charity brunch had turned the place into a hive of frantic activity. Strangers came and went with flower arrangements, tablecloths, and boxes of silverware. Helena felt like a ghost, wandering in the corners, invisible to everyone. Veronica, at the center of it all, supervised every detail, a charming smile fixed in place, but her eyes hard and calculating. It was during dinner that night that Richard, impatient with the bank's bureaucratic hurdles, pitched his new idea. "This brunch is good for our image, darling, but it doesn't solve our cash flow problem. We need capital fast." The objects in his office, the antiques, the paintings, they're idle assets. We should auction it all off. Veronica hesitated for a moment. The office was the center of Arthur's power, and emptying it felt like a final, audacious step. "I don't know, Richard. It might be too soon." He leaned across the table, his voice a persuasive whisper. "Think of it as an act of letting go, a way to show we're looking to the future, not the past, turning those assets into more profitable investments, maybe even into cryptocurrency, just as he would have. It's what a businessman would do." Helena, sitting at the table, felt the air leave her lungs. The office, the last untouched sanctuary of her father, with his books, his maps, and the scent of his memories. The idea of strangers putting price tags on his belongings was a violation she couldn't bear. Her eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away, refusing to give Veronica the satisfaction of seeing her cry. She looked at Maria, who was serving dessert, and the housekeeper gave her a quick glance, full of a shared sorrow. The ambition in Richard's eyes was contagious. Veronica considered it for a long moment, her fork hovering over her lemon tart. The brunch would give her the stage, but the auction would give her immediate financial power, free from the bank's constraints. A slow smile spread across her lips. "You're right. It's the smartest decision. Set the date." The date of the auction hung over the house like a death sentence. 7 days. That was the time Veronica and Richard had allotted to turn Arthur Sterling's memories into liquid capital. The dramatic ticking clock that Richard so desired now dictated the rhythm of Helena's life. Each tick was one less step, one grain of sand falling in the hourglass of her past. The mansion, already cold and impersonal with the brunch preparations, became even stranger with the arrival of the auction appraisers. Men and women in dark clothes, holding clipboards, circulated through her father's office, his sanctuary, with an air of clinical indifference. They touched the antique globes, measured the mahogany shelves, and analyzed the paintings with eyes that saw only figures. Every object, every piece of Helena's history received a small white tag with a number. They were just lots, assets to be converted into profit. Helena watched it all from a crack in the door, her heart tight. The flash drive in her pocket felt like it was burning, a promise she didn't know how to fulfill. "Trust our signal." Her father's voice echoed in her mind, but the signal remained an enigma. How could an 8-year-old girl fight against the world of adults, a world of business, auctions, and contracts she barely understood? Her only ally was Maria, whose loyalty manifested in small gestures. A plate of cookies left on her nightstand, a look of comfort exchanged in the hallway, a whisper of "Be strong, little one," when Veronica wasn't looking. The veteran housekeeper was like a safe harbor in the storm, but her powers were limited. She was an employee, and any open act of rebellion would result in her immediate dismissal, leaving Helena completely alone. One afternoon, while the head appraiser was cataloging the books on the desk, Helena saw something that made her hold her breath. The man picked up the heavy globe that stood beside her father's chair and stuck tag number 74 on its base. A memory, vivid and sudden, hit her like a wave. She was 5, sitting on her father's lap while he slowly spun the globe. "See this little island here, my navigator," he had said, his finger resting on a tiny dot in the middle of the vast blue ocean. "It's a special place. It's our luminous signal. If a storm ever separates us, look for the signal." At the time, it had seemed like just a game, an adventure story. Now, the words carried a terrifying weight. The signal wasn't a word or a metaphor. It was a place, a destination, an instruction. The globe wasn't just a decorative object, it was a map, the map to understanding her father's message. And it was about to be sold, carried away forever by some stranger looking for a beautiful object to decorate their living room. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She needed that globe. She needed to see that island up close to understand what it meant. But how? The office was always occupied, and soon all those assets would be packed up and taken away. She looked at the appraiser's hands, which were now noting on his clipboard, terrestrial globe, 19th century, mahogany base. He was sealing the fate of her only clue. The number 74, written in black ink on the small white tag, became the epicenter of Helena's universe. It was a small, insignificant number, but it represented the imminent, irreparable loss. The globe was not just an object. It was the key, the map, the last conversation she would have with her father. The panic that had seized her gave way to an icy clarity. She had to get to that globe before it was too late. But the office, once her refuge, had become enemy territory. During the day, it was occupied by the appraisers, and at night, Veronica locked it, citing the need to protect the valuable assets until the auction. The irony was cruel. She was protecting the monetary value of the objects while destroying their true worth. Helena spent a full day observing, studying the house's routines. Veronica was absorbed in phone calls, choosing the perfect dress for the brunch and reviewing the guest list to ensure the city's most influential people would be present. Richard, meanwhile, spent hours in meetings with the auctioneers, discussing profit potential and the best way to present Arthur Sterling's prestige assets. It was Maria who gave her the opening. The next afternoon, while Richard was out and Veronica was preparing for a meeting with the florist, the housekeeper approached Helena in the upstairs hallway. Her eyes, weary but full of a quiet wisdom, met the girls. "Your stepmother requested a special herbal tea," Maria said, her voice low and even. "It will take me a good 15 minutes to prepare it in the kitchen. The library door is unlocked." It wasn't a suggestion. It was a plan. Helena's heart began to pound. She thanked her with a nod, and as soon as Maria went downstairs, the girl ran, her bare feet barely touching the carpet. The silence of the house was deafening. Every creak of the floorboard sounded like a shout. She pushed open the heavy library door and slipped inside. The smell of wax and dust enveloped her, a breath of a past that was about to be auctioned off. Her eyes went straight to the globe. The white tag, number 74, seemed to mock her. With trembling hands, she spun it. Where was it? Where was the island? Her fingers traced the continents, the oceans, the geography of a world that suddenly seemed too big and frightening. And then she saw it, a tiny speck in the Pacific Ocean, exactly where her father's finger had rested years ago. She leaned in, her eyes so close to the surface that her breath fogged the varnish. Next to the almost illegible name of the island, there was something else. An inscription made with a fine needle, so small it was almost imperceptible. It wasn't a word, but a sequence of numbers and letters. A code, with her heart in her throat. She took a small pencil and a scrap of paper from her school supplies out of her pocket and began to copy the sequence, her hand shaking so much that the characters came out crooked. At that very moment, across town, Arthur Sterling received a call from Elias. "They've scheduled an auction, Arthur. They're selling everything from your office in less than a week." Arthur's calculated fury gave way to an overwhelming urgency. He couldn't let them erase his memories like that. His timeline for action had just been drastically shortened. Back in the library, Helena finished writing down the last digit of the code when she heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps on the marble hallway, approaching, slow, deliberate. The sound stopped right outside the door, and then the cold metal of the doorknob began to turn. The doorknob turned with agonizing slowness, and the door opened with a creak that echoed in the library's silence. It was Veronica, her eyes cold as two chips of ice, swept the room and landed immediately on the small figure of Helena, standing beside the globe. For an instant, time seemed to freeze. In a reflex driven by pure survival instinct, Helena crumpled the small piece of paper in her hand, the newly copied code turning into a fragile, sweaty ball inside her closed fist. She hid it behind her back, her body rigid with terror. Veronica's expression shifted from surprise to an icy fury. She walked slowly toward Helena, the heels of her shoes making a sharp, menacing sound on the wooden floor. "What is the meaning of this?" she hissed, her voice dangerously low. "Did I not forbid you from coming in here? What were you doing?" Helena swallowed hard, her throat tight with fear. The words wouldn't come. Her eyes were fixed on her stepmother's face, a mask of contempt and impatience. I just wanted to say goodbye," she stammered, the excuse weak and childish. Veronica let out a short, humorless laugh. "Say goodbye? Don't be ridiculous. These objects represent a considerable estate, Helena. They are not toys." She touched the surface of the globe with the tip of her finger, as if wiping away imaginary dust. "Goodbyes don't generate profit. All of this," she gestured dismissively at the entire room, "is just idle capital, assets that need to be converted. We're going to turn this dust into investments, into a future that doesn't include useless sentimentality." She grabbed Helena's arm with a force that made her wince and dragged her out of the library. With a sharp movement, she closed the door and turned the key in the lock, this time removing it and placing it in the pocket of her dress. "It is now permanently closed to you." Left in the hallway, Helena felt tears of humiliation burn in her eyes. She ran to the kitchen, where she found Maria finishing the dishes, her hands deep in soapy water. The housekeeper looked at her and, without needing words, understood everything. She dried her hands on her apron and hugged the girl tightly. The smell of cinnamon and home that emanated from Maria was the only comfort left in that place. "They're selling the soul of this house, little one," the woman whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "If there was anything I could do—" The helplessness in Maria's voice mirrored Helena's own. They were both prisoners in this fortress of wealth and ambition. Later, locked in her room, Helena opened her hand and uncrumpled the small piece of paper. The sequence of numbers and letters looked like an indecipherable hieroglyph. It was her father's last message, her only weapon, but she had no idea how to use it. The feeling of defeat was overwhelming. She had the key, the video, the code, but what could she do with them? She was just a girl against two adults determined to erase her world. That night, something was slipped under her bedroom door. It was an elegant brochure, printed on glossy paper. With a frozen heart, she picked it up. On the cover was a photo of her father's office, and, in gold letters, the announcement, "Prestige Auction of the Estate of Arthur Sterling," and just below, the date and time, in bold. It was for the next day, at 3 in the afternoon. The gavel would fall in less than 24 hours, turning her memories into ash and money. The day of the auction dawned grey and heavy, an omen of what was to come. The mansion, which in recent days had resembled a theatre stage, was now a veritable elegant circus. Luxury cars lined the driveway, and people Helena had only seen in society, columns entered with a connoisseur's air, auction catalogues in their hands like opera programs. Veronica was the star of the show, floating among the guests in a dark silk dress, her face a masterpiece of restrained grief and resilience. She accepted condolences, speaking in a soft voice about the importance of honoring Arthur's legacy by transforming his assets into energy for the future. Beside her, Richard acted as the discreet master of ceremonies, shaking hands, pointing out the most valuable lots, and mentally calculating the profits that would soon fill their accounts. Helena watched it all from the top of the stairs, a vantage point that made her invisible. To these well-dressed vultures, she was nothing more than an inconvenient detail, the orphan daughter who would soon be shipped off to some boarding school. The auctioneer, a man with a booming voice and theatrical gestures, began the bidding. One by one, the objects from her father's office were sold: the silver inkwell, the antique maps, the collection of pens. Each strike of the gavel was a blow to her chest. She felt every memory being torn away, priced, and handed over to a stranger. Then it was time for Lot 74. The globe was placed on a pedestal under a harsh light. The auctioneer described it as a museum-quality piece, a silent witness to great decisions and a vast fortune. Helena clutched the crumpled paper with the code in her hand, now useless. Hope had vanished, leaving behind only a cold, heavy emptiness. The bidding began, the auctioneer's voice rising and falling in a macabre melody. $10,000, $15,000, $20,000. The gavel rose. Sold. In that instant, something in the air changed. A cold draft seemed to sweep through the hall. Coming from the direction of the library, the heavy oak door, which Veronica had locked, swung open slowly, noiselessly, and in the doorway, silhouetted against the dimness of the shelves, stood him, Arthur Sterling. He was not a ghost, nor an apparition. It was him in the flesh, thinner, his face marked by a relentless seriousness, but unmistakably alive. A hush spread like a wave, a cascade of voices falling silent as heads turned. The auctioneer froze with the gavel in midair. A woman in the front row dropped her paper catalogue, the sound echoing in the absolute silence. Arthur said nothing. He simply walked to the center of the room, his eyes fixed on Veronica. In his right hand, dangling from his index finger, swung the small brass key with the anchor charm. Veronica's porcelain mask cracked. Her eyes widened in pure terror, the color draining from her face. Richard stood paralyzed, his mouth agape in an expression of disbelief and panic. Arthur stopped a few feet from her, his imposing presence dominating the entire room. And then he spoke, his voice calm, but with the weight of an avalanche. "This auction is cancelled." For a long moment, the only sound in the hall was the electric hum of silence. Arthur Sterling didn't move, letting the weight of his presence fill every corner of the room. Unraveling the web of lies Veronica had so carefully woven. It was she who broke the spell, attempting one last, desperate gambit to save face. A perfectly timed tear rolled down her cheek. "Arthur, you're alive! It's a miracle!" she exclaimed, her voice choked with manufactured emotion. She took a step forward, arms outstretched as if to embrace him. "We suffered so much, we thought we had lost you forever." Arthur didn't flinch. He simply looked at her with a coldness that stopped her in her tracks. "Your suffering seems to have passed rather quickly, Veronica," he said, his voice still calm but cutting like a scalpel. He turned to the guests, who were now witnesses to a drama far more real than any auction. "I apologize for the interruption, but there are certain truths that cannot be auctioned." At that moment, a second man entered through the library door, Elias, the lawyer, carrying a leather briefcase. Veronica turned even paler upon seeing him. The game had shifted from a shocking reunion to a legal execution. "Veronica and her companion," Arthur continued, with a slight nod toward Richard, "organized this event to celebrate a legacy, but they forgot the centerpiece of that legacy." His eyes traveled up and met Helena's, huddled at the top of the stairs. "My daughter." He didn't raise his voice. He raised the facts. Elias opened the briefcase. "Mr. Sterling," the lawyer began, his voice clear and formal, leaving no room for doubt, "established a family trust during his lifetime with very specific protective clauses for his heiress, clauses that Mrs. Veronica Sterling signed and was fully aware of." He produced a document. Clause 12b stipulates that the guardian has a duty to ensure the physical and emotional well-being of the beneficiary. guaranteeing her residence in the family home. Any act of expulsion or humiliation that deprives her of her safe harbor immediately nullifies the guardian's right to administer the estate, capital, or any assets of the family. A murmur rippled through the room. Arthur then turned to a woman in the front row. "Mrs. Eleanor, could you please tell us what you saw on the night of the memorial?" The elderly neighbor, with a courage that surprised everyone, stood up, her hands trembling slightly. "I saw the girl, Helena, alone, in the dark, outside the gate, with her suitcase. I took her in, but Mrs. Veronica came to get her, saying the school would handle it." The simplicity of the truth was devastating. Elias then delivered the final blow. "Based on this contractual violation and the neighbor's testimony, we are filing for an immediate residential restraining order against Mrs. Veronica and Mr. Richard. Access to all accounts and funds is frozen, pending a full audit." Richard, the opportunist, was the first to understand. The dream of easy wealth, of entering the circle of prestige, had shattered. Without a word, he turned and walked toward the exit, abandoning the sinking ship. Veronica was left behind, alone in the center of the hall, the stage she so loved now transformed into her scaffold. The whispers of the guests were the sound of her reputation disintegrating. Arthur ignored her. His eyes had only one direction. He crossed the room, climbed the first few steps of the staircase, and knelt, bringing himself to Helena's level. The crowd, the auction, the betrayal, it all vanished. The world shrank to that small space between father and daughter. "It's over, my little navigator," he said, his voice finally breaking with emotion. "The harbor is safe." The exodus was silent and swift. The guests, once accomplices in a social charade, now retreated with their eyes downcast, avoiding the raw truth that had been exposed. Veronica was the last to leave. Without her stage, without the audience's admiration, she seemed smaller, a figure stripped of all her power. She cast one last look at Arthur and Helena, a look that was empty, devoid of remorse, filled only with the bitterness of defeat, and then she was gone. The door closed behind her, and the house, for the first time in weeks, could breathe. The scent of expensive lilies and imported perfume began to dissipate, giving way to the familiar smell of wood and old books. Helena descended the last few steps, her small hand still clutching her father's with a strength that belied her size. She looked at the now empty hall, at the tagged objects, and asked, her voice a trembling whisper that barely dared to hope, "Can I go back to my room?" Arthur pulled her into a tight embrace, burying his face in her hair. "Your room was always yours, my little one," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm the one who's coming home." In the days that followed, the mansion underwent its final transformation, not with decorators and auctioneers, but with the care of someone rebuilding a home. The tags were removed, the cold, impersonal furniture was taken away, and the old, comfortable sofas were returned to their places. Maria, with a smile that couldn't fit on her face, filled the house with the scent of orange cake, Helena's favorite, a fragrance that banished the ghost of the lilies forever. Arthur, true to his word, announced that the library would no longer be an untouched sanctuary of his intellectual wealth. In memory of the harbor that had always existed between him and his daughter, he would turn it into a community study hall, a safe place for the neighborhood kids. The real investment, he explained to an attentive Helena, wasn't just in stocks or cryptocurrency, but in knowledge. The code from the globe, she discovered, was the password to a digital vault, a treasure trove of information where Arthur kept backups of all his important documents, including the video he had recorded and the clauses of the trust. It was his final signal, the definitive proof that he had always been watching over her, even from a distance. Life found a new rhythm, simpler and more true. Arthur's office was no longer a showroom for assets. Now, the great mahogany desk was shared between the complex reports of his business and Helena's colorful drawings. She did her homework there, beside him, and he helped her with her multiplication tables between a conference call and another about the future of his estate, a future that now had a clear and unwavering purpose. One evening, as the rain tapped softly against the window, Helena sat on the living room rug, building a castle with her old wooden blocks, which Maria had miraculously recovered from the donation company's warehouse. The piano, once a silent decorative object, now displayed a single frame with a recent photo of the two of them, smiling, with Maria in the background. In the dark polish of the instrument, their image was reflected, warm and alive. Across the street from her window, Mrs. Eleanor watched the light on in the mansion. She no longer saw a monument to fortune, but the glow of a home. Justice had not come like a thunderclap, but like the rising tide, slow, constant, and unshakable, clearing the sand and bringing back what had always belonged in that place: truth, loyalty, and the kind of active love that all the money in the world could not buy.